If you shut your eyes and visualize Winston Churchill, you likely perceive the identical image the remainder of the world envisions. You observe the elderly gentleman, the bulldog spirit, the heavy countenance fixed in grim determination. You see the cigar, clamped firmly between his teeth, and the fingers raised in the V for victory sign. You see the man who stood alone against Adolf Hitler when the rest of Europe had descended into darkness. You hear that voice, that deep, gravelly rumble that mobilized the English language and dispatched it into battle. We remember him as the inevitable hero. We remember him as the man who was forever destined to lead Britain in its darkest hour. We think of him as a statue constructed of bronze and marble, unshakable, unbreakable, perfect in his resolve. But history is not a statue. History is a chaotic and painful affair. And the truth is that the Winston Churchill we recognize was forged in fire. He was not born a hero. In fact, for a significant portion of his life, he was deemed a dangerous failure. He was considered a gambler who played with human lives like chips on a casino table. He was a man who was so detested by his own government that he was forced into exile. To comprehend the man who saved the world in 1940, we have to journey back 25 years. We have to return to a time when Winston Churchill was not an elderly man in a siren suit. He was young. He was 40 years old with hair that was barely receding and a face that was fresh and full of arrogant energy. He was brilliant. He was ambitious. And he was about to commit the greatest mistake of his life. The year is 1914. The First World War has just commenced. The great armies of Europe have marched to war with flags waving and bands playing. They thought it would be concluded by Christmas. They thought it would be a war of movement and glory. They were mistaken. By the winter of 1914, the war had frozen. The German army and the Allied armies of Britain and France had dug into the earth. A scar of trenches ran all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Millions of men were existing in mud and filth. Machine guns and barbed wire had transformed the open fields of France into slaughterhouses. Neither side could advance. If you attacked, you perished. If you remained stationary, you died. It was a deadlock of blood and iron. In London, the government was desperate. They examined the casualty lists that arrived every morning, and they despaired. They needed a method to break the stalemate. They needed a back door. They needed a brilliant idea that would flank the Germans and end the war before an entire generation of young men was wiped out. Enter Winston Churchill. At the time, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty. This meant he was the political head of the Royal Navy. It was one of the most powerful jobs in the world. Britain ruled the waves and Churchill ruled the Navy. He loved the job. He had spent years preparing the fleet for war. He had converted the ships from coal to oil. He had constructed bigger guns and faster battleships. He was obsessed with warfare. While the generals on the Western Front were staring at maps of mud, Churchill was looking at a map of the world. He was searching for a way to utilize the massive power of the British Navy to tip the balance. His eyes drifted to the east, to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey, had joined the war on the side of Germany. They controlled a narrow strip of water called the Dardanelles. This strait was one of the most strategic waterways on Earth. It connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. It was the gateway to Russia. Churchill had an idea, a vision. It was bold, it was simple, and it was incredibly dangerous. He believed that if the British Navy could force its way through the Dardanelles, they could sail right up to the city of Constantinople. They could aim their massive 12-inch guns at the Sultan's palace. Churchill was convinced that the Turks would panic and surrender. If Turkey was knocked out of the war, the supply lines to Russia would be opened. The Germans would be attacked from the south. The war would end in months. It sounded perfect. It sounded like the stroke of a genius. But there was a problem. The Dardanelles was a trap. It was a narrow channel of water only a few miles wide in some places. It was lined with steep cliffs, and on those cliffs, the Turks had built forts. They had placed heavy cannons overlooking the water, and in the water itself, they had laid rows of deadly naval mines, steel spheres packed with explosives floating just beneath the surface, waiting for a ship to strike them. Naval experts had always said that ships could not fight forts. A ship is a large floating target. A fort is buried in the earth. If a ship fights a fort, the ship usually loses. But Churchill was not a man who listened to experts when they told him what he did not want to hear. He was a man of supreme confidence. He believed in the power of the British battleship. He looked at the crumbling Ottoman Empire, and he saw a weak enemy. He called them the sick man of Europe. He did not think they had the fight in them. He did not think they could stand up to the might of the Royal Navy. He began to push for the plan. He used his incredible eloquence to persuade the cabinet. He bypassed the doubts of his admirals. He bullied and charmed and maneuvered until the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, gave the green light. The operation began on February 19th, 1915. It started as a purely naval attack. Churchill believed he did not even need soldiers. He thought the ships could do it alone. A massive armada gathered in the Aegean Sea. It was a majestic sight. There were British battleships and French battleships, great steel castles floating on the blue water. They steamed towards the mouth of the Dardanelles and opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. The ground shook for miles. The Turkish forts at the entrance were pulverized. Clouds of dust and smoke rose into the air. In London, Churchill was jubilant. It seemed to be working. The outer forts fell. The minesweepers moved in to clear the channel. The path to Constantinople seemed to be opening up. But as the ships moved deeper into the straits, the resistance stiffened. The Turks were not running away. Under the command of German advisors and a brilliant Turkish officer named Mustafa Kemal, they were digging in. They had mobile artillery batteries hidden in the hills. These guns would pop up, fire a shell at the ships, and then disappear. The British ships were taking hits. Then, disaster struck. On March 18th, 3 Allied battleships struck mines and sank. 300 men died in minutes. The naval attack was called off. Now the only option was a land invasion. Troops from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula. They called themselves the Anzacs. They expected a walkover. Instead, they walked into a meat grinder. The conditions at Gallipoli were atrocious. It was scorching hot. The dead bodies lying in no man's land began to rot in the sun. This brought the flies, millions of flies. They covered everything. If a soldier opened a tin of beef, it would be black with flies before he could get a spoon to his mouth. Then came the disease. Dysentery swept through the camps. Men were so weak they could barely stand. They were living in holes dug into the dry, dusty earth, constantly under shell fire, constantly thirsty, constantly sick. Months dragged on. May, June, July, August. Churchill in London was watching his career disintegrate. He had staked everything on this operation. He had promised victory. Instead, he had delivered a disaster. The casualty lists were growing longer every day. The newspapers began to turn on him. They called it Churchill's folly. They called it the Dardanelles disaster. The political pressure became unbearable. The first Sea Lord, Admiral Fisher, who was the professional head of the Navy and an old friend of Churchill, finally snapped. Fisher had always been skeptical of the plan, but he had gone along with it. Now he could not take it anymore. On May 15th, Fisher resigned. He did not just resign. He walked out of his office and locked himself in his room, refusing to speak to anyone. He wrote a letter to the Prime Minister saying he could no longer be a party to the Dardanelles operation. He famously wrote, "Damn the Dardanelles, they will be our grave." Fisher's resignation triggered a crisis in the government. The opposition party, the Conservatives, demanded heads on a platter. They hated Churchill. They saw him as a reckless adventurer. They demanded that he be removed from the Admiralty. Prime Minister Asquith was weak. To save his government, he agreed to form a coalition with the Conservatives. The price of that coalition was Winston Churchill. Churchill was fired. He was removed from the Admiralty. The job he loved, the job that defined him, was taken away. He was given a humiliating demotion. He was made the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. It was a title with no power. It was a job for a retired politician, not a 40-year-old dynamo. He was devastated. He felt physically sick. He later said that he felt like his veins had been cut open and his life was draining away. He sat in his office with nothing to do while the war raged on. He watched from the sidelines as the Gallipoli campaign dragged on towards its inevitable tragic conclusion. The soldiers on the peninsula were still dying. A new offensive in August failed. The winter came, and the heat turned to freezing rain and snow. Men froze to death in their trenches. Finally, in December, the order was given to evacuate. The only successful part of the entire campaign was the retreat. The troops slipped away at night, leaving empty trenches behind them. The final tally was horrific. Over 100,000 men were dead. Another 400,000 were wounded or sick. The Ottoman Empire was still standing. Russia was still cut off. It was a total defeat, and the blame landed squarely on the shoulders of Winston Churchill. He was a pariah. When he walked into the House of Commons, men turned their backs on him. He was jeered in the streets. He fell into a deep depression. Churchill had always battled with what he called his black dog, a dark, melancholic shadow that would descend on him. Now the black dog was howling. He sat in his garden at Hoe Farm painting for hours, trying to quiet his mind. But he could not silence the guilt. He could not silence the voices of the ghosts of Gallipoli. He felt that his life was over. He told his wife Clementine, "I am finished." But Winston Churchill was not a man who could fade away. He realized that he could not stay in London sitting in a meaningless office while men were dying because of his orders. He felt a need to pay for his mistakes. He felt a need to share the danger. He made a decision that shocked everyone. He resigned from the government completely. He traded his suit for a uniform. He packed his bags and went to France. He did not go as a general. He went as a major. He was going to the trenches. This is the turning point. This is the moment where the arrogant young politician died and the leader began to be born. He arrived at the Western Front in a cold, wet November. He was given command of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. These were rough men, Scottish miners and laborers. When they heard they were getting a disgraced politician as their commander, they were not impressed. They thought he was a tourist. They thought he would stay in a safe chateau behind the lines. Churchill surprised them. He moved into the dugout with them. He lived in the mud and the lice. He wore a French steel helmet because he thought it looked dashing. He carried a pistol. He went out on night patrols into no man's land. At first, the men laughed at him. He brought his own bathtub. He had hampers of expensive food sent from London. He smoked his cigars in the rain. But they soon realized that he was utterly fearless. One day, a shell landed near his headquarters and blew a piece of shrapnel through his coat. He just brushed it off. He seemed to believe that he could not be killed. He walked upright along the trenches while bullets zipped past his head. He cared for his men. He fought with the high command to get them better rations. He organized sports days to keep up morale. He famously declared war as a game to be played with a smiling face. For 6 months, Winston Churchill served in the hell of the Western Front. He saw the horror of war up close. He saw what happens when generals make mistakes. He saw the waste of life. He saw the blood and the guts and the fear. It changed him. The arrogance was burned away. He learned humility. He learned the value of the common soldier. He learned that war is not a game of chess played on a map. It is a brutal, chaotic struggle for survival. He wrote letters home to Clementine that revealed a changed man. He wrote, "I feel I am being used for a purpose." He began to believe that he had been spared for a reason. While he was in the trenches, the political situation in London was shifting. The war was going badly. The government was unstable. People began to whisper that perhaps they had been too hasty in getting rid of Churchill. They missed his energy. They missed his ideas. But the ghost of Gallipoli still haunted him. Every time his name was mentioned, someone would bring up the Dardanelles. He had to fight his way back inch by inch. In 1916, he returned to London. He spoke in Parliament, not as a minister, but as a soldier who had seen the truth. He warned the government about the shortage of shells. He warned them about the new technologies like the tank. He was an outsider, a prophet, crying in the wilderness. It would take years for him to climb back to the top. He would serve as Minister of Munitions, Minister of War, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. But he would always be viewed with suspicion. He was the man who had failed. He was the man with the blood on his hands. When the 1930s arrived, and the shadow of Hitler began to fall across Europe, Churchill was an old man. He was in his 60s. He was politically isolated again. He was warning the world about the Nazis, and the world was ignoring him. They called him a warmonger. They said he was trying to start another war to make up for the last one. But when the disaster finally struck in 1940, when France fell and the British army was trapped at Dunkirk, when it looked like all was lost, The British people did not look for a safe pair of hands. They did not look for a cautious man. They looked for a fighter. They looked for a gambler. They looked for the man who had stared into the abyss at Gallipoli and survived. They realized that the very things that had caused the disaster, his stubbornness, his refusal to accept defeat, his willingness to take risks, were the exact qualities they needed to survive against Hitler. The tragedy of Gallipoli had stripped him of his vanity, but it had left him with his resolve. It taught him that victory is never guaranteed, but it must always be chased. It taught him that even when you are beaten, even when you are humiliated, you must never give in. In the end, the disaster at Gallipoli did not destroy Winston Churchill. It created him. It was the fire that hardened the steel. Without the failure of 1915, there would have been no victory in 1945. The beaches of Gallipoli were the training ground for the beaches of Normandy. So when you see that statue of the old man with a cigar, remember the young man who stood on the deck of a battleship watching his dreams sink beneath the waves. Remember the failure because it was the failure that saved the world. When Winston Churchill returned from the trenches of France in 1916, he was not greeted as a hero. He was a political ghost. He walked into the House of Commons and the room would go cold. When he stood up to speak, the hecklers would shout one word, Gallipoli. It hung around his neck like an albatross. It was the shorthand for incompetence. It was the proof that his judgment was flawed. The years between the wars were not kind to him. They are known as the wilderness years. For an entire decade from 1929 to 1939, Churchill was cast out of the inner circle of power. He was an MP, but he held no office. He was a voice screaming into a void. He spent these years at his country home, Chartwell. He built brick walls with his own hands. He painted landscapes. He wrote massive history books. To the outside world, he looked like a retired volcano, extinct, a relic of a bygone Victorian era. But inside the volcano was still active. He was watching the world, and what he saw terrified him. In Germany, a corporal named Adolf Hitler was rising. Churchill read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, when most politicians ignored it. He saw the hatred. He saw the plan for conquest. He began to warn the British government. He told them to rearm. He told them that the German Air Force was growing faster than anyone believed. But nobody listened. And the reason they did not listen brings us back to the Dardanelles. The British establishment looked at Churchill, and they remembered the gambler. They remembered the man who had exaggerated the chances of success in 1915. So when he said Hitler was a danger, they thought he was exaggerating again. When he said Britain needed more planes, they thought it was just Winston trying to stir up trouble. His past failure acted as a shield for Hitler. It blinded the world to the truth because the messenger was damaged goods. This is the great irony of his life. The failure of Gallipoli did not just haunt him personally, it endangered the world. It meant that the one man who saw the truth was the one man nobody would trust. The 1930s dragged on. The Nazis marched into the Rhineland. They marched into Austria. They marched into Czechoslovakia. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and came back waving a piece of paper promising peace in our time. Churchill sat in the corner, grim and silent. He knew that war was coming. He knew that the bill for cowardice would have to be paid. Then came September 1939. Hitler invaded Poland. The illusion of peace shattered. The world was at war again. And in that moment of crisis, the British government realized they needed the old warrior. They needed the man who understood the sea. Prime Minister Chamberlain invited Churchill back into the government. He gave him his old job back. First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a scene straight out of a ghost story. On September 3rd, 1939, Winston Churchill walked back into the same room he had been fired from 24 years earlier. The same desk, the same maps on the wall. The story goes that the board of the Admiralty sent out a signal to every ship in the fleet. 3 simple words. Winston is back. But Winston was not the same man. He sat at that desk, and he was surrounded by the ghosts of 1915. He was terrified of making the same mistakes. He was cautious. He checked every detail. He knew that he could not afford another Gallipoli. But history has a cruel sense of humor. Almost immediately, he was faced with a situation that looked exactly like the Dardanelles. In April 1940, Hitler invaded Norway. It was a lightning strike. The Germans seized the ports and the airfields. The British rushed to intervene. They sent the Navy. They sent troops to land on the beaches of Narvik and Trondheim. It was Churchill's responsibility, and it went wrong. The British troops landed in deep snow. They had no air cover. The German Luftwaffe bombed them relentlessly. The ships could not get close enough to protect them. It was a disaster. The British were forced to retreat in humiliation. The press sharpened their knives. They screamed that Churchill had done it again. Another amphibious landing, another failure, another retreat. It looked like the end. It looked like he would be fired again. And this time, he would never come back. But then something extraordinary happened. The Parliament held a debate on the Norway failure. It was one of the most famous debates in history. The anger in the room was explosive. But the anger was not directed at Churchill. It was directed at the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. The politicians realized that the failure in Norway was not because of recklessness. It was because of weakness. It was because Britain had been too slow, too timid, too unprepared. They did not blame the man who tried to fight. They blamed the man who had failed to prepare for the fight. On May 10th, 1940, Neville Chamberlain resigned. That same morning, the German army launched its blitzkrieg into France. The tanks were rolling. The Stuka dive bombers were screaming. Europe was collapsing. King George VI summoned Churchill to Buckingham Palace. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Winston Churchill kissed the king's hand. He was appointed prime minister. He was 65 years old. He had qualified for his pension. He was taking over a country that was on the brink of defeat. As he was driven back to Downing Street, he remained silent. Later, he wrote about that moment. He wrote, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." He meant all of it, the victories and the defeats, especially the defeats. Gallipoli was the hidden blueprint for the Second World War. You can see its fingerprints on almost every major decision Churchill made between 1940 and 1945. The first lesson he applied was about command. In 1915, the Army and the Navy had hated each other. They did not talk. The ships shelled the forts, but the Army was not there to occupy them. Churchill vowed this would never happen again. He created a new position for himself, Minister of Defense. He took personal control of the military strategy. He forced the generals and the admirals to sit in the same room. He created the Combined Operations Command. He told them that there was no such thing as an army problem or a navy problem. There were only war problems. The second lesson was about amphibious warfare. Churchill knew that to win the war, Britain would eventually have to invade Europe. They would have to land an army on a hostile beach, just like at Gallipoli. But he swore he would not send men to be slaughtered on the sand again. He became obsessed with technology. He remembered the soldiers dying in the water at V Beach because they could not get off the River Clyde. So he ordered the invention of specialized landing craft ships that could drive right up to the sand, lower a ramp, and let a tank drive off. He remembered the lack of supplies at Gallipoli because there was no port. So he ordered the construction of the Mulberry Harbors. These were massive, artificial concrete ports that could be towed across the English Channel and sunk off the coast of France. It was an idea that sounded insane. Floating concrete harbors. But Churchill pushed it through because he remembered the chaos of 1915. The third lesson was about the soft underbelly. Throughout the Second World War, Churchill argued constantly with the Americans. The Americans wanted to attack Germany directly across the Channel as soon as possible. They wanted a straight fight. Churchill hesitated. He was terrified of a premature landing in France. He had nightmares about the sea turning red with blood again. Instead, he argued for an attack in the Mediterranean. He wanted to attack Italy. He called Italy the soft underbelly of the crocodile. Historians often criticize this. They say Churchill delayed D-Day. They say he wasted time in Italy. But if you look at it through the lens of Gallipoli, it makes perfect sense. He was trying to redo the strategy of 1915, but do it right this time. He wanted to knock out the weaker ally first. In 1915, it was Turkey. In 1943, it was Italy. He believed that if he could break the weak link, the whole German alliance would collapse. He was fighting the ghost of the Ottoman Empire on the shores of Sicily. And then came the ultimate test, June 6th, 1944. D-Day. The night before the invasion, Churchill was a wreck. He was pacing his office. His wife, Clementine, said she had never seen him so agitated. He told his wife, "Do you realize that by the time you wake up in the morning, 20,000 men may be killed?" He was not thinking about strategy. He was seeing the faces of the men at Gallipoli. He was seeing the wire. He was seeing the machine guns. He had sent men to a beach once before, and it had destroyed him. Now he was sending 150,000 men to the beaches of Normandy. If D-Day failed, Churchill knew it would be the end of civilization. But he also knew it would be the Dardanelles multiplied by 1,000. But this time, the lessons had been learned. When the ramp dropped on Omaha Beach, it was hell, but it was not a failure. The specialized tanks that Churchill had championed, the funnies that could clear mines and bridge trenches were there. The artificial harbors were there. The air support was there. The Navy and the Army worked as one machine. The soldiers broke through the Atlantic Wall. They did not get pinned down on the cliffs. They moved inland. Churchill waited for the reports. When he heard that the troops were off the beaches, he wept. It was the tears of a man who had been carrying a burden for 29 years. The ghost was finally laid to rest. The mistake of 1915 had been redeemed by the victory of 1944. But there is one final chapter to the story of Churchill and his disaster. After the war was over, Churchill lost the election. The British people thanked him for saving them and then voted for a new government to rebuild the country. Churchill went back to writing. He wrote his memoirs. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He became the most famous man on earth. But he never forgot the men he left behind in Turkey. In 1955, near the end of his life, he was asked by a journalist if he had any regrets. The journalist expected him to say something about the Iron Curtain or the atomic bomb. Churchill sat quiet for a moment. He took a puff of his cigar and he said, "I still wish we had taken the Dardanelles." Even at the age of 80, he was still replaying the chess moves in his head. He still believed it was the right plan, just executed by the wrong men. He still believed that if he had been given a little more luck, he could have saved those 100,000 men. The story of Winston Churchill is not a story of perfection. It is a story of resilience. It is a story that tells us that failure is not fatal. Most politicians today are terrified of making a mistake. One scandal, one bad policy, and their career is over. They play it safe. They pull test every word. Churchill teaches us the opposite. He teaches us that you can make the biggest mistake imaginable. You can be responsible for a catastrophe. You can be hated. You can be exiled. But if you have the courage to learn from it, if you have the courage to go into the trenches and rebuild your soul, you can come back. He was the man who fell the hardest so he could rise the highest. The disaster at Gallipoli was a tragedy, a waste of human life that should never be forgotten. But in the strange calculus of history, it was a necessary tragedy. It stripped the vanity from a genius and turned him into a leader. It took a politician who wanted glory and turned him into a statesman who wanted survival. On the cliffs of Gallipoli today, there is a monument. It stands over the graves of the Anzacs and the British and the Turks. It is a quiet place. The wind blows off the Aegean Sea. The water is blue and peaceful. It is hard to imagine the blood that once stained it. But if you listen closely to the wind, you might hear the echo of the lesson that saved the world. You might hear the whisper of the man who learned that the only way to reach the mountaintop is to survive the valley of the shadow of death. Winston Churchill was not a hero because he never failed. He was a hero because he failed spectacularly and refused to let it be the end of the story.